All right, good morning. I'm going to go ahead, excuse me, and call the meeting to order. Why don't we start down at Barb's end and just everybody go around and tell us that you're here and who you are for the members of the public.
Barb Lieberoff, Illinois EPA.
Rick Cobb, Illinois EPA.
George Roadcap, PRI, Illinois State Water Survey.
Larry Stoner, Mayor of Monticello.
Charles Hostetler, Peoria Disposal Company.
Donovan Griffith, Illinois Manufacturers Association.
Alec Davis, Illinois Environmental Regulatory Group.
Andrew Rain with Prairie Rivers Network.
Oh, sorry.
That's okay. Claudia Lenhoff with Champaign County Healthcare Consumers.
We're on. Deb Finan, I'm Mayor of City of Champaign.
Representative Carol Ammons, Champaign-Urbana, 103rd District.
Thank you. State Senator Scott Bennett, 52nd District.
Diane Marlin, Mayor of Urbana.
Charles Smith, Mayor of Rantoul.
Keith Gleason, President, Teamsters Local Union 627, Peoria, Illinois.
Steve Jerner, representing Illinois Farm Bureau.
Eric Ballinger, Republic Services.
Julie Moore Wolf, Mayor of Decatur.
Todd Zaluka, Mayor of Hayworth.
Teresa Barnett, retired DeWitt County Emergency Management Agency.
And we're all jealous. All right, so the first item on our agenda is the approval of minutes from October 15th, 2018. We have a motion from Mayor Stoner. We have a second. We have a second from Representative Ammons. Are there any corrections or comments? All right, all those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed, same sign. Motion carries. I had, too late, asked Barb to include a public comment in our agenda before our discussion of the draft, because I thought it might be helpful for the committee to have the public's input as we discussed how to arrange the draft in kind of this final month. What's the committee's feeling on that? Do we want to have hear that comment before we have our discussion? Does that make some sense? I'm seeing lots of nods, yes. We can still have public comment at the end as well, but I'd like to give members of the public who are here that opportunity. So normally I think they come to that seat that we've got all of our stuff on. Is there a microphone there? Oh, yeah, I always forget they're not wired. If you want to come up, just state your name, and if you have an affiliation, that would be great as well. And we just want to give you an opportunity to give us whatever input you want to give us before we start this longer discussion. So come on up.
Good morning. Randy Locke, PRI, State Geological Survey. I can provide these comments in written form as well, but just want to commend the task force on pulling together a very good report and have a number of comments. I was able to provide the report to a number of PRI groups, the Mahomet Aquifer Response Team, the Natural Gas Working Group, and then receive feedback from those groups. Those groups did meet. And they were asked to provide comment just on whether or not they saw any additional balance questions or also saw some gaps within the report. There are a couple of highlights I'd like to share with you. One of them is that there is a potential gap in the report that we were talking about it amongst those groups, and that one is calling for an aquifer-wide monitoring network. And being able to support that for comprehensive monitoring. There's very detailed description for characterization with HTEM and additional data collection But having a comprehensive monitoring program, in our view, is also a very important step in being able to protect the aquifer. Additional language and potential costs could be provided for potential inclusion in the report. Secondly, related to that, Appendix H is about detailed costs of doing some water quality analyses of historical data. We asked that that would be removed so that that could be rolled into this comprehensive monitoring approach. And then lastly, I do have two things. One is that the task force in the past has talked about either a top 3, a top 5, or a top 10 number of recommendations based on the ranked recommendations that the task force has done. And we would recommend that there not be a top 3, 5, or 10 that coming out, that the prioritization that you've done is important enough, and that the amount of work that is able to be done is really subject to what the legislature is able to provide as far as resources. So the ranking is the important part, not necessarily a categorization of what can get done, because we don't know what resources could be available for that. And lastly, because the report is very complex and detailed, we certainly offer our support in being able to help prepare the final draft if that's useful to the task force. And we would ask to be involved in that process, just so that we can make sure that some of those details that we've asked for here are included accurately. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And yeah, normally we don't do that, but I've got some questions too. So come on up, Randy. Go ahead, Jim.
Yeah.
I think Jim Risley, CUSD. The monitoring system you're talking about, the long-range one, broad one, can you be a little specific in what you're talking about there, how that would be done, or what type of monitoring?
Well, I think George has got a lot of existing activity. There are, the water survey is involved in that type of monitoring. During our discussion, but during the discussion at PRI, we were thinking it would be important to have a comprehensive aquifer-wide monitoring strategy. Right now, there's individual monitoring networks that have a very important coalition of groups that are funding that. But for it to be comprehensive and protective of the aquifer as a whole, recognizing that as an important activity throughout the aquifer and being supported by the state, we thought was an important recommendation.
So this would include like core sampling, the HTM, water sampling, any of that, or?
No,
No.
completely separate.
Okay.
Think of it as characterization, what's the physical resource, and then monitoring the resource. So you actually have an ongoing understanding of what the condition of water quality, water levels are.
Okay, thank you.
My question just relates to the, what y'all are willing to do as far as helping Rick and how that would be coordinated. So if the committee is interested in doing that, what that would look like.
We can offer any help and all help that the task force would like. We have a strategic communications group headed by Trish Barker. We have full editorial capabilities. We can provide graphics work. We can, whatever is helpful to the task force to meet their need of producing the report, we can provide that assistance.
Oh, yeah, go ahead, Chapin.
Chapin Rose. Quick question on your substitute aquifer characterization paragraph.
Could I have a copy of that?
It's on my computer. Here, somebody give him a copy. Yeah. Yeah, understood. on or about 23.
Okay, so Senator Rose, I think everybody's got it.
Okay. So, first of all, you're identifying zones in your second paragraph. You talk about area 2. I'm not sure, in area 5, are those referring to Appendix E or Appendix F? Or where's the map of those areas?
In the report, Senator, this is Rick Cobb. We haven't added any of those maps yet, so they're
So I'm not
currently not in the draft that you've got.
Okay. So, one, we got to make sure that there was a reference to something that you can actually look at. The second thing is, it would be helpful if you guys would tell us what the dollar amount is for each area, rather than just 2 of the areas.
Yes, that'll be in the final document. And I want to point out that the 2 areas, 3 and 5, are just an example because we had some discussion before not to prioritize individual areas. Someone had brought that up. So, but I did want to give an example of what individual areas would cost.
Yeah, and I realize there was some debate about whether to prioritize or not to prioritize. The fact is, this is going to get phased. If the money ever shows up, it's going to be phased. So it'd be helpful to have an ability to phase it. And, it'd be nice to know what those dollar amounts are. And I think it'd be ridiculous if we didn't put some priority over the natural gas leak portion.
Okay, anyone?
I think Area 2 actually does cover the natural gas area. It's either one way or the other. Tell me, is 5 on the west side and 2 on the east?
I believe so, yeah.
Yeah, so
Transition area.
actually, not a shaped up map, but in that presentation that's on the website from Jason Thomason, there's a map in there with the areas. But that's going to be cleaned up for the final report.
Okay. So question for Randy, or go ahead. Go, Representative.
I just wanted to clarify on the classification and the characterization of the aquifer. This recommendation on the changed language, does it take in consideration the prioritization, especially of closed landfills that may be over the aquifer? Does that include this here, or just the 2 areas that you mentioned here?
Well, the 19.8 includes the whole aquifer.
That's the whole.
For the first part, for the HDM studies. And so part of that, area 2 is 4 million, area 5 is 3.3, then the other areas make up the other 12 million. For the monitoring, there's a lot of monitoring that we currently do in the Mahomet Aquifer, and it's all funded by a lot of local sources, the water company, Imperial Valley Water Authority, towns of Bloomington, Normal, Decatur. But there are gaps, and there are a lot of gaps in that network. And so what we want to do is plug a lot of those holes in the network and, get better monitoring equipment on each of them with continuous recorders that can feed it to the website, so people can see what goes on when, Decatur turns on their well field or something like that. So, and then also that would include some of the ambient water quality sampling, and that is kind of in one recommendation 3 on page 24. So.
And Appendix G.
And Appendix, yeah. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I think it does. I guess I was looking for something that kind of gives you high-level threats, right? Some kind of visual that says these are the high-level threats in these areas, but I guess we can't do that until you actually start a monitoring process, right?
So you're asking how the monitoring
How do you
network
determine, right, which is
addresses the
most
specific
dangerous,
threats?
right, yes.
Yeah, we could add language in there to that effect, but it would have to be approved by everyone.
So Randy, I've got a follow-up question on, so just listening to George, so you're So we have recommendation 3 and appendix G relating to improving the understanding of the ambient water quality and a budget that's laid out in appendix G. So when you said there was a gap, are you adding to this recommendation, or is this a separate recommendation? If you go to page 24, and appendix G, actually, there's a budget. I'm a little confused. Which isn't unusual, I guess.
I'm just looking for Appendix G here in the back. Do you have a page in Appendix G?
It is the very end.
It's the very end. Go to the back.
I see Appendix H as the draft budget.
Okay.
That's, G is the ranking.
Yeah, it's H.
It's H.
It's H,
Yeah.
yes, and.
It's a draft report, so.
Yeah. No, I'm just making sure I've got my
So what I'm
letters
trying to
correct.
figure
So what
out
I,
is,
what I
so-
was saying is Appendix H, we had asked, the recommendation or request is that that specific budget be removed, for several reasons. One is, H is, covers essentially historical water quality review. Data that are available now that are in the databases, information for previous samples that have been collected, that's the scope of the budget for Appendix H. This Appendix H is then should be part of a larger comprehensive look at monitoring data, not only historical monitoring data, but also a monitoring program that goes forward and continues to collect data and samples to monitor the health of the aquifer.
So that task that in the existing budget 8 that you're looking at, that includes new monitoring wells, when you're saying it just focuses
No.
on existing?
This
There's
is,
a task 3.1.
3.1 is collection of new samples, monitoring wells, and the total for that is $58,000. For the aquifer that covers a 15-county area, $58,000 is not sufficient for that.
I gotcha. So you're scrapping that budget altogether, I get, is that it?
What we're asking is that this be removed and we can come back with revised language and a better understanding of the scope of the comprehensive monitoring program.
And then that in relation to the comprehensive groundwater I'm just trying to weigh if you've looked at how this relates to I think it's section 6 of the Illinois Groundwater Protection Act that lays out for a comprehensive network of monitoring wells to be developed, monitoring wells, private wells, community wells, et cetera. Does that somehow tie into that existing?
It doesn't grow out of that,
Statute?
but it would certainly be coordinated with it so that it wasn't duplicating effort.
Okay, yeah, because there have been pilot networks of private wells. There is the dedicated monitoring well network that's run by the Department of Ag. And then there's the ambient community well network. So would there be an analysis to look for gaps of those existing networks and then try to fill
Certainly.
in where some of those gaps are? Was that
Certainly, the
part of
existing monitoring
discussion?
networks would have to be part of that overall plan
I
to
would
make
think
sure
so,
that,
yeah.
that the aquifer as a whole had coordinated monitoring, and that monitoring then, whoever was collecting the data, it could either feed into that or understanding the health of the aquifer. And we did not have monitoring gaps or areas that were not monitored.
And this isn't just quality, you're talking about quantity. You're
It
talking
can be
about
water levels as well.
levels and quality. So quantity and quality.
It's water levels and water quality.
Anyone else have questions for Randy while he's
I
on
do
the
have a
hot seat?
question. Teresa Barnett, DeWitt County. So you said that if we took that out, that you would bring back different figures. What kind of time frame are we talking about? Because we're operating on a very short time frame now.
Certainly. And so some preliminary numbers have already been developed, and I think those are under review right now. So it could be a fairly short time frame We have Thanksgiving coming up, so I'm anticipating that it would likely be perhaps the following week or shortly thereafter.
Okay, I'm gonna, oh, go ahead, Donovan.
Just one quick comment to the addition here you have under Aquifer characterization. On the last line of paragraph 2, when describing Area 5, you have the line, there's a threat of nitrate contamination. In the report, we've actually identified nitrate as a potential threat. So if we could just add potential before threat so that it's consistent through the report. So just a quick comment on that.
Okay, we'll do that.
Anybody else? Thank you, Randy.
Thank you.
So we've had some new people come in, but we are taking public comment that we will do it again at the end, but if there are any members of the public who wish to speak, to have it considered before we have our discussion. And Andrew, did you have something?
Yeah, this is Andrew with Prairie Rivers Network. In the draft, it lists potential route, potential threat, and threats, and nitrate is among the threats.
Yeah,
Page
but,
7.
okay, I'll just, Steve Turner, Illinois Farm Bureau, I guess. I can bring this up later since we're in the part discussion of it, but I guess one of the things as I prepared for this today and seeing what we had come up here, some notes that I took. With the threat, you know, what we categorize and what we have as a draft, I guess what I'm trying to say is I would hope the nitrate could, key reference would be a potential threat because, you know, I've gone on record as saying before, you know, it's acknowledging, I call it as I look at an issue, but I've also tried to acknowledge the fact that I think it needs to be potential, mainly because of, and mainly on the western side of the aquifer, we have a denitrification process that's not going to totally take it out, but it does lower that nitrate part of the ground right there. So I think that's, you know, more of a potential situation right there, unless, you know, there again, unless we're going to keep everything as a threat. But in my own mind and from personally speaking, I think from the membership Illinois Farm Bureau and what I've learned on this group, when you look at the nitrate situation, I don't put it to the threat of what I've learned from the eastern side with the gas issue and things you have like that. I think to say both of them are the same exact threat, I don't think it's being realistic. So I'll shut up and let somebody else comment.
Well, and I'll just point out through all of our meetings in Subcommittee A where we identified threats, if you go to page 12 of the report, we actually see the nitrate is listed as a potential threat. And as a full committee, we have not gone to change or voted to change any of the classifications we did in Subcommittee A. So since Subcommittee A determined nitrate as a potential threat, I would recommend, unless we have a broader discussion of why that shouldn't be, or if we're going to go through Subcommittee A's work again, we leave it as a potential threat.
Yeah, and just one other thing, finish up, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. The one pager I went off a lot has always referred it to as a potential, and I guess I've always looked at that as kind of my reference on that as I've looked at that. It's always referenced as potential too. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
Diane?
Farther down, road salt is listed as a threat. It's nitrate different from road salt.
There's an inconsistency in the report between page 7 and page 12 on how some of these are listed. And I guess, yeah, one of the reasons for putting nitrate as a threat is because of the New Holland, you know, in New Holland, Illinois, where the wells are contaminated by nitrate. It's just an example.
So we have one situation that I'm not disagreeing with what you said there. Of course, you would know on that, but I think to apply that uniformly across the aquifer on that and to tie that from what I think agricultural side of it is a whole different, I don't know, lack of a better phrase, can of worms when we deal with that one, what we do as farmers with fertilizer and application and things like that. So I just, you know, but I just, you know, I'll just literate again. I think the potential is, wording that is very important to us, and I think it's something, as we've discussed at Illinois Farm Bureau with our membership and everything, is whether that's important enough to, you know, whether we can go along with the total report if it's still in there. I think that's a decision we got to make, but it's a very important issue to us.
So we've talked about minority and majority reports. If we can't get consensus, we can certainly vote on that particular issue. Before we get to that discussion, though, I do want to continue to allow members of the public to have input. Representative, did you have something you wanted to add on?
I just wanted to get the legal definition or the regulated definition of what would make it either potential or a threat. You know, I don't want to do industry definitions. I would like to have the actual regulated definition of nitrate.
Everybody's looking at you, Richard.
I'm pointing.
Yeah, we've certainly provided some detailed discussions of that throughout this process, and I can go through it. Under Section 12A of the Illinois Environmental Protection Act, there's the word threat. And so that's a very broad legal proscriptive term. And generally, and if you look at the nitrate fact sheet, generally we look at 2 to 3 milligrams per liter of nitrate as being naturally occurring. Anything above that, we generally look as a threat under Section 12A. And then also under Section 620.301 of the board's groundwater quality standards, there's threatened to add treatment or additional treatment. And the lowest common denominator of understanding that treatment or additional treatment is a private water supply well, and they don't treat. So therefore, if we're degrading above that naturally occurring level, then under the Environmental Protection Act, that would be considered a threat. Then there's also a numerical standard where if you exceed that, that's 10 milligrams per liter. That's actually also where the drinking water standard is set. And that's an acute contaminant. In other words, it's been thought to cause methylhemoglobinemia, the blue baby syndrome. So that's what it means under the Illinois Environmental Protection Act and the board's groundwater standards. However, this legislation, the way it was worded, subgroup A and B, if I go back to the original legislation, does somebody have that? It uses the word threat in a different way than the existing legal meaning. I mean, it doesn't change that legal meaning, but if you go to page 7 of the report, Representative Famans, the work groups had to, so the legislation says identify potential and current contamination threats. So it combined potential and current with the word threat. So it's a change from, so in the Environmental Protection Act and the board's groundwater standards, there's actually a chemical contaminant present, which I would always call a known source. Whereas a threat, from the way this is written, is also a potential source. So there's a little bit of a disconnect between the legislative mandate and the law. And so the way the work group tried to deal with that is to come up with those two definitions. And Charles, you were so you got definition 1 and definition 2. And so that's the way we tried to resolve that issue. So it's a little complicated, unfortunately, but that happens sometimes with legislation.
So, this is Andrew with Prairie Rivers Network. We never write out definitions of these things, and we talked about it a couple times, and I feel like we never got a firm definition, and if we did, it's not in this. I mean, even this, what we focused on in Subcommittee A, which is more of a scope of what we considered, not defining how we considered those things, it doesn't say and here's what a potential route is, and here's what a potential threat is, and here's what a threat is. And we talked about it a little bit, but I don't know if there was a vote. I was unable to join on the day we talked about this because there were technical difficulties.
Actually, they did vote on that, Andrew, and that's also on page 7. If you look at after the two kind of, in pursuing the exercise, 1 and 2, then at Subcommittee A, use the process above to identifying potential sources of groundwater pursuant to the IGPA, and then appendices B and C detailed that process, and then Subcommittee A identified the following: potential routes, potential threats, and threats to the aquifer, and those are listed. And then the Subcommittee A went a step beyond that and actually did worksheets for each one of those, and those are right up front in the document. So it was a rather detailed process for how that was done.
We don't have a definition for potential threat, potential route in the document. So anybody who reads this has no idea what that means, unless it's buried in those B and C appendices that I haven't read fully. But I mean, I think it needs to be up front. If we're going to be using terms, we need to define them.
We'll let the subcommittee talk to that. I'm not on the committee.
Okay, so I'll add that to the list of things for us to talk about. I want to go back to public participation. We've gotten a little far afield. Want to give them an opportunity to have input before we have our larger discussion. So if there are any members of the public who wish to address us, please step forward.
Press the button.
Hi, I'm Joe Hooker, and most of you are familiar with me. I was working with the city of Champaign on the litigation we had with Clinton Landfill and creation of the Mahomet, the sole source aquifer designation. I was very involved in that matter. Just to elaborate a little bit on some comments I shared with some of the members about the latest draft and comments I've made earlier, one of my big concerns continues to be making sure that sufficient resources are identified to accomplish some of these actions that everybody's talking about. In particular, I zeroed in on the recommendation concerning abandoned wells, and that strikes me as arguably the most pressing matter to deal with abandoned wells we don't know about. We don't know if they were properly sealed. And as I understand it, these wells, including wells that are drilled and have now been abandoned for oil drilling, are penetrations through the aquifer. That's what I understand typically to be the geology, similar to the type of man-made penetration that was created the problem with People's Gas more recently. So, and the recommendation in the current draft is something to the effect of devote more resources to this, something to that effect. And my concern is that there be more emphasis or focus on that and some urgency given to the notion of quantify that. What do we mean? What resources do we need? And this also brings to mind comments I've seen in at least a couple of the annual reports, maybe it's annual or every 2 years, that are required by the Groundwater Protection Act. I've seen at least a couple of times the Illinois EPA express concerns about ongoing staff reduction and how that will affect their ability to continue to fulfill their mission with regard to groundwater. So my hope is that there will be a continuation of and more attention, frankly, given to that, and direction given to the responsible agencies to actually do an internal audit, identify how many people do you need, how much money do you need, instead of this very general notion of devote more resources to that. So that would be one concern I have about where we're at right now, and I appreciate that you've been tackling a whole lot of issues here, and I applaud the task force for the comprehensive overview that you've performed. That's been very, very, I think, helpful and as far as having some real progress on how we can more effectively protect the aquifer. And so that would be one thing I would suggest. The other thing I'd like to emphasize again, and I shared this earlier, is taking a closer look at requiring this HTEM technology for various specific applications for permits, including landfill permits, while we're waiting to see if the General Assembly will devote enough money to do a comprehensive survey of the aquifer with that technique. The report pretty much says, gee, this is a great new technology, has lots of advantages over current technology that we're utilizing with regard to the aquifer, which I understand largely to be soil borings. And so I think it's reasonable to assume that it may be a kind of tough sledding to get $20 million or whatever for the entire aquifer. And in the meantime, it strikes me as completely sensible to really take a close look at requiring this better technology and the performance of that technology as a precondition of permits for particularly hazardous activities, including new landfills or expansion of landfills. And I know Clinton, I know the representative from Clinton, understandably pointed out what their soil borings have shown and that sort of thing, and talks about his credentials. I guess I would remind everybody that there were some very highly credentialed people who had some real serious disagreements with Clinton landfills experts regarding the underlying geology at the Clinton landfill. More specifically, the potential that there are irregular breaks in the clay soil overlying the aquifer. So it's all well and good to talk about credentials and experts and whatever, but it's also important to, again, be reminded that experts disagree sometimes about these things. And when you tie that with the obvious examples of this new technology, I think that's still worth seriously considering, at least until we actually implement a comprehensive analysis of the aquifer with this new advanced technique. And that would basically be my comments. And again, I thank you all for your hard work and the very comprehensive nature of what you've reported to date. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else from the audience? Come on up, Chris.
Can I make a comment about something that Mr. Hooker just said? Teresa Barnett, DeWitt County Emergency Management Agency. One thing that he was talking about was utilizing the HTEM for future permitting, landfills, that type of thing. And I'd just like to make the point, which I've made before, which is it is not the objective of this task force to deal with any type of local government permitting or the standards that they use to do that. That's not something that we're focused on. Thank you.
Dr. Storr.
Thank you. And let me add my sincere appreciation for all of you who are taking so much time and working to try to institute protections for our sole source of water in this area. My name is Chris Storr. I am a engineering geologist, have done research work for over 35 years, some of it very specifically on landfills and landfill failures, as well as other engineering and environmental problems. I also sit on the Champaign County Board, and in that capacity, I would like to inform you that a resolution is working its way through the Champaign County Board to recommend and encourage actions to preserve the water quality and sustainable availability of water for the Mahomet Aquifer for all the citizens of Champaign County and of course, the area that it serves. And although this resolution is still working its way through the county board, it has passed the Environment and Land Use Committee, and I wanted to bring this up while you folks are still drafting the final report. And it will, I'm sure, be submitted to Ms. Lieberoff and the IEPA after it passes. But I'll just call your attention to the Champaign Board's concerns about the sustainable use and preservation of water quality from various threats to the aquifer and caused by large cones of depression, and also specific concerns relating to the legacy landfills and the desire to promote improved inspections using technology such as remote sensing and GIS to make inspection maps, to institute preventive actions for the storage, processing, and transportation facilities that contain large quantities of materials that could threaten the aquifer. And of course, the desire to have public notification of breaches of contamination, such as at the Manlove storage facility near Mahomet, the source water contamination, road salts, arsenic, nitrates, and in, as the previous speaker spoke of, improperly sealed and abandoned wells, and also for household hazardous waste that routinely gets put in with our trash and carried to existing landfills, and of course exists in great quantities, although unknown, with the legacy landfills. Also, we promote public education, including conservation, timely notice of unusual events, and establishment of a regional organization, perhaps an extension of the Mahomet Aquifer Protection Task Force, as has been brought up previously. I'll be glad to answer any questions, but I just wanted to call your attention to this resolution that's working its way through the Champaign County Board.
Are there any questions? Representative.
Dr. Stewart, can you just qualify again on page 7 as we talked about the categorization of potential route, potential threat, and threat, as you guys have talked about that on the landfill. And then just a couple of comments here that Mr. Stewart served on my environmental panel for several years now. And one of the things that was raised that you can maybe speak to is that the report does not really highlight very specifically the 218 landfills that really lie over the Mahomet Aquifer. Some of them are not operable right now, but can you speak to those two issues there?
Thank you, Representative Ammons. Yes, the compilation of legacy landfill structures that was taken from the Illinois Environmental Protection Agency files back in the 1980s, prior to the adoption of the new Subtitle D regulations that govern existing operating landfills. These legacy landfill structures are the old town dumps, the old sanitary landfills that were covered, that were unlined, covered by a minimum of 18 inches. That's this distance here from the tip of my finger to the bottom of my elbow of final cover. Now, this, I would point out that the average frost penetration in Illinois is on the order of 30 2 feet to 30 inches, and in some places down to more than 50 inches. So that means that the existing covers that have been in there for a long time might have been compromised. Also, the covers get deformed because of decomposition of the waste, and that inspections of the landfills are done by inspectors walking around in the field, which with limited amounts of time, and may not be able to examine all of the landfill, and especially with problems during certain seasons where grasses and weeds are high, or maybe features that are not physically accessible. And use of technology such as remote sensing and LiDAR can help identify these defects in landfills that have been shown to be overlooked during field inspections, so that inspectors can better evaluate the conditions of the covers and where maintenance and repairs might prevent infiltration of meteoric waters through the covers and mixing with the waste to produce leachates that we all don't want. These 218 landfills sites are just that. They're sites. And I would point out that in at least a couple of cases, they may consist of between 4 and 7 landfills or structures at any particular site. So it's actually a larger number than just merely 218. And some of these go back as much as 100 years. And this is an area of research that I've looked at for a very long time, and I think that these caused because of the unregulated amounts materials that were put into some of these old structures, that these constitute a threat to our water resources, both surface water and shallow and deep aquifers. Does that answer your question, or over-explain it?
Anyone else?
I think I followed the first few minutes.
I would just note, particularly page 2 of your resolution, in my humble opinion, goes beyond the scope of what we were statutorily tasked with doing. So it may be things that you would like to see done, but I'm not sure if you want to direct it to the Mahomet Aquifer Protection Task Force. Maybe you revise this slightly so the things on page 2 are kind of future actions that need to occur. And I'll just make that suggestion since county board's going to be voting on it.
There's time to make that.
All right. You can have mine. All right, anyone else have anything for Chris? All right, go
Chris,
ahead, Rick.
Chris, I've got a question. On the 218 landfills, so I think according to the database, there are 25 Part 807 landfills. Does that subtract from the 218? And then that number are the ones that were landfills that didn't have any type of permitting structure whatsoever and aren't inspected by Illinois EPA. The Part 807, there were regulations in 1970 that applied to them. Those 25 of those, so just to get my numbers right and helping write this report, does that 25 subtract from the 218?
I wouldn't think so. I think because some of these sites have numerous landfills that date back to, as I said, over 100 years. These are former dump sites and areas that have probably preceded state almost certainly preceded state regulation, which I think began back in the, 70s or earlier.
So the answer actually is yes, that the 25 would subtract because, I mean, if it's 100 years old, these aren't landfills that had groundwater monitoring wells, weren't inspected, weren't certified for closure, all of those things. Those would have been prior to, so when you're talking about people walking around doing inspections, nobody's, that I'm aware of, I just want to make sure that people are clear what you're talking about.
Well, I think, thank you for making that distinction. You're almost certainly correct. Some of these very, very old landfills probably, in fact, are not inspected at all, and except by the landfill owners. And because they're so very old, we probably don't have any particular records about what might be in those landfills, but these would have to be ferreted out by taking a look at industries and practices and so forth in the area that might have contributed waste to those former dump sites. In my opinion, these pose a particular problem and threat to water resources because they don't have the protections that were instituted even in the 1970s, and certainly not the protections that are under the new Subtitle D.
Chris, this is George Roquette from Water Survey. As a county board member, how aware are you of the ones in the county, or how would any county be aware of the possible liability, or, are the owners, you say the owners of these landfills, but are there owners to each of these landfills, and do they know that they exist and that they're a problem, or that they even own them?
Dr. Roadcap, that's a very good point. Some of these landfills almost certainly are known to the owners, and I would and I've heard of instances where some of the landfills properties have been abandoned by the owners through not paying taxes, and basically leaving these as orphan properties that would fall under the kind of vague, I don't know who would have responsibility. But again, some of the landfills are owned, perhaps by municipalities, industries, or individuals. Did I almost answer the question?
Thank you for your time. Is there anyone else from the public who wishes to speak? And we'll do public participation again, but just pre-discussion by the committee. Okay. So the next item on our agenda is presentation and discussion of the draft report. Rick, did you want to present anything to get us started?
Well, unless you have another, well, there's two things. We have the draft report, and then we also have the report where the full task force, I think, is vetted, the recommendations and the committees. And then there are comments that we received by the deadline that are added to the report so that you all can look and hear about those. So there's two different reports, one with comments on the side. And I can walk through both reports. And then there were recommendations that were just presented today that are brand new that weren't in, but we've already discussed some of those.
Well, if you do the one that has comments.
Correct.
It would take
Right.
into account what has already been vetted and give us an opportunity to look at the new stuff, correct?
That's correct.
Okay, so why don't, is everybody okay with starting there?
I don't know.
Okay, so why don't we start that way, and if you want to hit some highlights for us before we start our discussion, that'd be great.
So I'm assuming you've all had probably a chance to look at the report. And so we didn't do an executive summary, and we didn't do a lot of final figures and maps and things in this version.
And Rick,
But-
I'm going to stop you for a minute. If any members of the task force have a question
Yeah,
as
that's
he's
fine.
going through, let's interrupt him on that page instead of waiting till the end.
Okay. So like I said, we thought once the full draft is developed, then we can go to developing an executive summary. And so we just start out with the introduction, and what we tried to do here was basically take the comments that were provided by the task force at the last meeting that we had in Decatur, and rearrange the report and try to answer or address some of the things that you ask about. So for example, at the last meeting, if I recall, there was really nothing in there that sort of brought out the importance of this aquifer. So this whole introduction is intended to address that comment by the task force. Diane.
I hate to start with the first paragraph, but first of all, thank you for defining what an aquifer is. I think that's important. But I also think for both the executive summary and for this introduction, since we're asking the state to potentially spend millions of dollars, I think we need to have a very strong statement to the effect of, and I'll send some suggested language to PRI maybe for when they do the final, but the Mahomet Aquifer is one of Illinois' most important natural resources. It serves as the sole source of drinking water for X 100,000 people. All of us have a responsibility for maintaining the quality and quantity of water. And then how the task force was created, and then what its charge, and all that I think should be before you actually get into defining what an aquifer is. So it
Well, I
just
think that-
lays the case right up at the front.
Wouldn't that be in the executive
Both.
summary?
I think in
which
both.
would be
I
right
really
in the
think.
front?
I think in both, but
In,
yeah.
would that be okay in the executive summary, or?
Well, it should be in the executive
it would-
summary,
yeah.
yes.
So I mean, do you
But-
want to change the introduction to that, or I think those things definitely should be in the executive summary.
I think it doesn't hurt to say it twice,
Okay.
in case
And
someone
so-
misses it in one of
I
those
agree.
places.
So we got that down, I'm sure, in the minutes.
I'll send some language.
Okay. So, we did try to talk about the Mahomet Aquifer and the science and how it serves as a source of drinking water, and how it's one of the most, the western side is one of the most susceptible areas in the state of Illinois, and it is the only sole source aquifer. And then we got into talking about the task force and what the task force did and what they started building upon, and the members of the task force. And so just a summary of that. And then we tried to put a lot of the detail of the presentations and reference materials into the appendices. So would it be appropriate to open up these comments at this time, or how do you want to do this, Deb?
Well, I think anybody who's got questions or comments as you move through it, I think should just speak up.
Well, one thing,
I think we have some general comments and process issues, but if there's something that somebody sees as you go through it, they ought to tell you.
well, Senator Rose had this particular question right here about, we need more information on the permitting and process for landfills with respect to local siting, that whole comment. So I did bring with me today the chief of the Bureau of Land, who permits, inspects, and does everything with respect to landfills. Todd Reddick. Todd, I don't know if you want to, Chapin, if you want to ask questions. We tried right up here, Todd.
Let's start by asking, what are the opportunities for the public to have input prior to a siting?
Well, local siting approval is entirely a local issue. So the application is made to the local jurisdiction. They do the analysis, the evaluation. They grant it, they don't grant it. And that's a precondition that they have to demonstrate to the Illinois EPA in order to get the permit. But the Illinois EPA doesn't have any kind of substantial role in the siting process itself. We don't comment on it. We don't evaluate it.
So what was required of the local governments when they go through that process?
Actually, I'd have to get my notes, but there's a section in the Environmental Protection Act that sort of spells out the entire local siting approval process, and it's, it could easily be referenced in a report, to say, here's where local siting, here are the legal requirements for local siting, that kind of a thing.
So can you change categories of substance that is being taken in from an original permit via a permit modification without having a subsequent second siting hearing at the local level?
Well, interestingly enough, right now the question or the answer to that might be, I'm not sure. There was a recent decision out of the 5th Appellate District. We call it the Brickyard decision. It's very recent, where the court seemed to focus primarily on local siting approval, looking at the location of the facility rather than some more of the specifics of volumes or heights or dimensions or the types of materials. Before Brickyard, we would have looked very carefully at the siting that was given by the local authority and prior permitting to try to determine whether or not additional local siting was required. After this decision, there's a bit of a split between two different appellate districts in Illinois. And the Illinois EPA is discussing this with the Attorney General's office right now to determine if an appeal is, whether we would seek an appeal to the Illinois Supreme Court or not.
What's the split? What are the two
Well,
sides?
the other districts were focused a bit more on some more of the specifics. So if in local siting application that's made to a local authority, they say we're going to take X, Y, and Z in our dimensions, or our waste capacity is going to be X. If you change those things, oftentimes that would require additional local siting approval. The 5th Appellate District, the Brickyard Court, was focused much more on did the local authority agree that we've been talking about landfills, but is a landfill appropriate in this location, without focusing nearly as much on what was accepted or dimensions of the landfill itself or waste capacities, that kind of a thing. So it's a pretty bright distinction between those two lines of case law.
Is the entire aquifer in the 4th district? I don't know.
I
the
don't
answer to
know. I don't know the boundaries off the top of my head of the districts.
that. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know either. So, again, okay, so who is the appropriate local jurisdictional authority?
Well, it might depend. It could be a county, it could be a municipality. It depends where the
Is it a
facility is
single entity,
located.
though?
I'm sorry?
Is it a single entity?
Yes.
So.
It depends, it all depends on where the proposed facility is located. You know, what the jurisdiction is.
Right, but I guess where I'm going with this is if the entity is in, you know, the corner of a city, for example, which would make the city the municipality, the local government entity, but the downstream flow of any problem would be in the county. Those folks have no capacity to intervene?
Oh, they may be able to intervene from a legal, procedural perspective, but I think.
But in the siting?
But I think, that's what I mean. But I think the ultimate decision is probably in that kind of scenario with the municipality.
So they could come make comment, but they couldn't.
That's my understanding of it, but please understand that that's just not an issue that the IEPA,
I understand.
We just don't have we don't have a statutory role in it. We don't participate in it. We don't review it, comment on it, attend meetings, hearings.
But you're saying right now, if you have a permit to receive X, and there was a local siting that was approved to receive X, and then a modification of permit is written to receive X and Y, it's an open question as to whether you have to have a second siting to receive Y?
Some of it may be exactly what X and Y are, in the sense that under the Subtitle D regulations that were referenced a little earlier, there are certain things that are, go into the definition of municipal waste, and there are things that are outside of that. So it could fall on that. But part of it too right now is we are trying to understand the impact of this decision. I mean, it's very recent. We're still well within the time period for seeking appeal with the Supreme Court. So we've had some internal discussions trying to figure out how would we implement this, how important is it for us to seek a unified, clarified approach in Illinois. Well, that's very much an open question for us right now.
Todd, are you staying for a little bit? So if we have
Yes,
more
ma'am.
questions, okay.
I rode
thank
with
you.
Rick.
He can't leave. Okay, so, all right, well, let's just kind of keep going this way unless, so this was something we just discussed, and I think Andrew was saying there isn't besides what's been written here, and Representative Amons was asking about this, but Subcommittee A took on the task of identifying what were termed potential and current contamination threats to the water quality of the Mahomet Aquifer. And Subcommittee A, which a lot of people from the full task force participated in this, focused on where contaminants have been found in the aquifer and appear to require treatment or have degraded the natural water quality or exceed the potable reefs groundwater quality standard. And then the second instance is where it's more of a potential source. So you've got an identified source and a potential source. Although the way the statute reads, it concatenates potential and current with the word threat, which, as I described, is a little bit different than, it complicates things a little bit. And then I thought I heard a lot of, I think Steve was weighing in on, in this case, should nitrate be put up under potential threat versus threat? And so probably as a, let's see, and then there were multiple people, including Claudia and Teresa Bennett had some comments here. Claudia was recommending adding this industrial process by products and hazardous materials. So I don't know how you want to proceed, if you want to leap into the things that have been fully vetted by the task force. I think that would be that discussion of threat versus potential threat. In the worksheet, nitrate is listed as a potential threat, and right here it's listed as a threat. So I think it's up to the task force to make a decision on that.
So, go ahead.
Since our audience for this report is the General Assembly and the general public, I think, number one, I agree with Andrew, we need to define these terms, but my question is, which of these items listed under threat have been found to contaminate the aquifer today?
Well, the way it was written, the things that have been found to contaminate the aquifer, like it says threat, known groundwater contamination. So arsenic is naturally occurring, so.
So it is known to be in the
Yeah,
aquifer?
it's in the aquifer. Road salt, it's known to be a contaminant. We have increasing chlorides in certain parts of
In the groundwater?
aquifer, in groundwater, so it's a source. We've certainly had source waters that are susceptible, that have found contamination, especially on the western side of the aquifer, which is kind of what Steve Turner keeps talking about. The eastern side of the aquifer is not as vulnerable to contamination, except for certain areas, as the western side of the aquifer. And so we have in the transition, on the eastern side of the aquifer, we found very little nitrates in the groundwater. We have an ambient network comprised of community water supply wells. The Department of Agriculture has dedicated groundwater monitoring wells at the edge of farm fields. We found very little. On the western side, we have, and as Steve says, as far as drinking water goes, there is a denitrification process that does occur. We're still, it is found in the groundwater, yes. So it's a little bit of both. I mean, yeah. And obviously Peoples, I mean, that's a known source of contamination. Hazardous waste and byproducts.
Keeps turning off.
Household hazardous waste? Yeah, probably. I think you could probably say that that's been found.
Okay.
No. Maybe it should be potential threat.
That was an accident in the editing process. It was
Okay.
designed to be a potential threat, like a legacy thing.
That,
Charles Hostetler, the listing of household hazardous waste and pharmaceuticals and personal care products under the threats was not consistent with the intent of Subcommittee A. It's an editing mistake, and it should be in the bullets up above potential threat.
This is George Roadcap from the Water Survey. There is in Appendix C kind of a discussion of the potential sources, and there is some definitions in Appendix C, and maybe that needs to be moved up. And I just want to point out that, I think, and someone can correct me, that part of Subcommittee A was to focus on the things that aren't being addressed. So there are a lot of hazardous material storage and other things, underground storage tanks, landfills, active landfills that are heavily regulated. And, if something were to go wrong at one of those sites, there's already a response pattern in place. So I guess some of these threats that we were focusing on were more the things that maybe is in the gaps or not, front and center, or they're, a little bit hard to navigate with the current legislation.
So I would say if that's the case, then we need to make sure that the document explains that, so it doesn't look like we've just ignored a bunch of things that we already have regulation around.
Well, if you guys recall, I hate to do this to you,
Oh,
but I
please
did have
do.
those up front, and you wanted me to move them to the appendices. So just saying.
But I've slept since then.
Me too.
I would just suggest moving Appendix C up to the body of the report.
We can move it back. It can move.
So, the definitions in Appendix C are.
Andrew, why don't you say who you are for Barb's record keeping?
Is Andrew with Prairie Rivers Network. The definitions in Appendix C really don't shed light on this. It talks about a potential source. We're using the definition of potential threat. So those don't mean, there needs to be a clear accepted definition inside this document that states what's a potential threat, and a potential route. And I would also note that the potential route is not defined in our directive as something we were asked to identify. So there's a lot of.
Potential route is an abandoned well. It
Okay.
already has a statutory definition, just FYI.
I understand that, but we were asked to identify threats, so I feel like maybe, we can bring that definition into what we've done, and that's fine. It just needs to be clear that we're identifying these things based on certain specific definitions.
Well, just let me elaborate on that, Andrew, the potential route. And somebody else was talking about it earlier, about the importance of, was it either
Chris?
Randy or Chris? Anyway, Joe. And so I get it that the well itself doesn't have contaminants, but it provides a direct pathway for contaminants. So it's really important. And in a number of these communities that have adopted restricted use ordinances and are using risk-based remediation approaches where contaminants are left in the shallow aquifer, it's really important to have an idea of what's drilled through those or what holes are going in there. So that's why that was picked up as a high priority concern, especially in those areas.
Yeah, it sounds like a threat.
Is it a known source of contamination?
Claudia, go ahead.
Well, Andrew, I thought at first that part of what you were saying was that there seems to be some conflation of the language between threat and a route, but just that we need more clear definitions. But I think as a layperson, one of the things that I wanted to say that is, confusing, frustrating, and that I keep, trying to get my head around is that, when we say things like, is it a known threat? I think, many of us are concerned about the future and about, taking action in a precautionary kind of way. And I understand that that we also have to identify when we have, known threats. But I think that's where maybe some of the squishiness comes in. And, for example, we can have landfills that have engineered barriers, and those will be good for however many decades, but maybe the substances that are going into the landfills have a longer lifespan than that. And there's a, maybe way in the future there's a potential threat. But anyway, I just wanted to express from a layperson's perspective, this notion about a known threat versus, something that is a potential threat. Some of that gets a little hard for me to track. I do appreciate what you've said about that any well can be a conduit. Anyway, I just wanted to say that. I guess also the other thing that I wanted to ask, and maybe I think industry people feel pretty strongly about this, but the distinction between a threat and a potential threat, it seems like we're going to have a lot of dialogue or discussion or disagreement about what gets listed under what category. And I'm not sure that I understand what the stakes are beyond, the stakes in terms of contamination to the aquifer. But for those entities who care very much about that distinction, what's at stake there in that distinction? Can you just sort of maybe talk about that and make that more plain spoken so that we all understand?
Charles, you want to go ahead?
Thank you, Charles Hostetler, PDC. So I'm going back to the very beginning of Subcommittee A and one of our first meetings where we started our journey of frustration and confusion. And not everybody came to the Subcommittee A meetings, of course, but we had we've talked about these paragraphs 1 and 2 a number of times. They've been changed. We've had proposals to change the language where people have volunteered. They've brought up certain things. They said, I'll go take it, I'll provide you. In some cases, we got rewording back. In other cases, we got nothing. At the end of this, I think we met 6 or 8 times. This is what we came up with. Okay, so I'm sort of like Rick. We've been through several different iterations. My priorities were trying to get a sense of the committee and as much consensus as we could to go into this process. And I'll just say my views here are pretty simple. If you've got known contaminants in the aquifer and you can put a piezometer or a well there and measure them, or if you have people on bottled water because they can't use their drinking water, that is a known threat in my view. If you have a situation more like paragraph 2, where source materials have been impounded, that implies some concentration of source. There's never been a source control, never been a regulatory requirement, and there's no groundwater monitoring program at the site, and it's over the Mahomet Aquifer, and it's in an area that's susceptible to infiltration. That, in my view, is a potential threat. Okay, so you have something that's waiting to happen, but some kind of transport has to happen to get the material from where it is now through the environment down into the aquifer. So that's, in my view, the primary distinction. I also think one area where we got confused was this notion that was brought up again, that we did make a conscious decision, and I don't think it's very well reflected, except in a couple words there, without regulatory requirements, that when there was a regulatory body, when there were inspections, when there were groundwater monitoring, we moved those to the very, very bottom of our concerns. Okay, so there's really 2 things going on. One is actual contamination in the groundwater that you can measure right now. The other is a concentration of potential contamination that it'd have to move to get into, and is not currently covered by regulation, inspection, monitoring.
Claudia.
Okay, I just, I appreciate your response. I'm just wondering, in terms of the nitrates, we're talking about earlier the difference between potential threat versus threat. But then on page 12, there's a map that shows the nitrates and the concentrations, right? Is this in the aquifer? And if this is in the aquifer, then isn't that a threat?
It is, and this is part of the confusion and we have talked about this before. The aquifer is not the same everywhere, okay? And that's part of the reason we're confused. is not because we haven't tried to figure this out, or it's because it's a confusing situation. And in some places, it is more common to find nitrates at levels of concern in the groundwater than at other places. And now it's Steve's turn to have the table.
I guess your map visual shows that side. There's the Steve Turner, Illinois Farm Bureau, forgot to identify itself. There's no doubt about that. But one of the things, when Rick was talking about nitrates, okay, you've got, and he knows more about it than I do because he's educated us a few years, we've got in Mason County in that recharge high aquifer area, let's just put that area in your head, they've got the beginnings of a test well over there now. And lack of, for the shallow readings of that, like under 30 feet, if I'm right on that, it's not real deep where the water is really at. They're starting to get some concern with some, as they get their data worked out and everything, and Rick can explain it better than I, starting to show some nitrate readings. Right now, they're kind of sporadic. And we're, as ag, we're starting to work with them a little bit here to say, okay, what's doing that? What I contend here, and some of you probably get tired of me hearing it or saying it, is as a farmer over there and an irrigator, yeah, we're concerned up here. But as I know Charlie and I talked to him and worked with, the reason that wording is so important about that denitrification is, of all the irrigations we have over there, which is a lot, when we pump irrigations, we're pulling from 80 to 100 to 120 feet. I'll stop there for a minute. That's where I argue the potential side, because we really haven't tested that or know really what's down there with any good source. Now, I'm not going to sit here with any of you and sit here and say to agriculture, like, we don't have a problem, leave us alone. No. That's where I think potential comes in right there. And like anything we do in ag, we work constructively, and we're doing that already right now to start, okay, let's see where we're at on things like that. Not to bore you, let's see what different farming practices do to some of those readings there. And that's what we're working on. And I'll just close by saying one thing. I started out today, when you look at this thread up here, and I got it up here on my iPad, I just go back again from what I've learned on this to have nitrate there. They didn't have, you call it man love, I call it natural gas showing up in water as the same potential threat. You know, right now, we don't have to use bottled water. We don't have to do anything over there in a lot of our farms and operations for drinking water, okay? So that's why I feel very passionate about the distinction right there. And I think being on this task force has educated me. My God, if I got that stuff showing up in my drinking water like you have over there, that's a heck of a lot different threat. And I kind of look at nitrates, in my mind, puts it to a potential threat. So that's my sales pitch to you, okay? So,
Oh, go ahead.
So quick question, based on the definition and the confusion, why can't it show up in both?
Well, and I'm also wondering the step line.
Why can't nitrate show up as both a potential threat and a threat? Because based on what you guys described, it sounds like that's what it is.
I'm also wondering if we could say something along the lines of, depending on the area of the aquifer,
well,
or say something that makes that, I mean, I think if you look at page 12 and 13 and you read the language, it makes it clear that it depends on the area of the aquifer. And so if the concern is somebody's just going to scan that list and jump to a conclusion, maybe we reference the pages for more information, or we make it clear that it depends on the location. Charles, did you? Chapin.
I'm just, did the subcommittee put it as potential or threat?
The subcommittee struggled with the issue, but it ended up as where it is now. The only thing that's different on this list than where we intended is the household hazardous waste and pharmaceutical is in the wrong place. But all the rest is where the subcommittee left it.
So, okay, and my follow-up question was to your motion to put household waste up to potential. That included pharmaceutical, Charles? And because
We had it all lumped together, and again, that's probably not a full decision by the committee. And there are examples of pharmaceuticals in the Mahomet Aquifer as well. You are quite correct.
I mean, the pharmaceuticals, a big enough deal, there's a whole other group that's getting underway to meet on that.
Yes.
And I think pharmaceuticals should stay at threat. Quite frankly, there's a mountain of data all over the world that this is a huge problem. And we're creating superbugs out of it. It's less of a threat to the Mahomet Aquifer, just a threat to the human population. Okay. I kind of like Todd's point about splitting the baby.
Steve's nodding. I don't know if that's consent.
He's not yeah, thank you. When you say doing it in both, the first thing that comes to mind is if, and believe me, I don't have that off the top of my head right now, that it identifies the concerns I've made there about, we're working on some situations, but as we sit here today in the deep part of the aquifer, the main part of the aquifer over there, we have nothing in front of us right now that shows that contamination there. Now, it doesn't mean, like I said, we're going home and saying it's nothing to worry about, we're not gonna do anything about it. That's what I'm trying to say right there is the potential side of it. And now there's some contrary feeling about being in the threat side of it. I understand that, so, but to answer your question, I guess I'd have to see how, for lack of a better term, how we word it in there before, I really say yes or no, and that's up for everybody else to make their own decision on too, so.
Representative.
I just wanted to clarify also that I think Steve helped me understand why I would support it, if at best, in both locations, right, on this list. Because as I look at the map itself, even if we've not done a great job with monitoring all of these sites, which apparently, according to this report, we have not, I don't think it's in the best interest of the public to minimize the danger of the nitrate because we've not done a good job monitoring it and in some ways remedying it. And so I would certainly support us putting it in both locations, right? Because there is a potential, maybe a smaller potential in some aspects of this map, but a greater potential in other areas of the map that would, not necessarily raise major alarm, but that we would minimize the true potential risk or the identified known risk that nitrates pose in the other parts of the county, of the aquifer itself. And I think there's a lot of research, and I'm not an expert, there's plenty of them in this room, that will identify the real concerns of nitrates and the runoff of those nitrates. So I think I'm okay with putting them in both places, potential but not just one.
Well, and I
Go
might
ahead,
just make
Steve.
one other follow-up comment. One thing is, that's been thrown out here, and I digest that a little bit. And I guess I opened this up to the group, and you made your point very well. I know where I'm wanting to come from it and what I believe on it there and what agriculture believes on it, but what confusion does that create with it being listed twice on that? And I'm giving that as an open-end question to the group here, because I know what I want to see in my mind and try to go along with the group. But sometimes we do things and think we found an answer and find out, the confusion factor does have me a little concerned of having it twice, okay? And I address that question to everybody.
I mean, I think the language can identify, as you clarified in here, goes back to Andrew's point about the clear definitions of these things. You can clarify it in why it has been listed here and here, right? Because this map does that for me. It helps me to see why it should be listed in both places with a identifying definition of what it means here as opposed to the other locations in the aquifer.
Charles?
As we're considering that proposal, I'd like to point out, could you move back up to the list itself, Rick? Yes. So there are some other things that look like nitrates. Arsenic is present in the aquifer where you can measure it in certain places, particularly in Tazewell County, and we heard about that from an expert. And it's not present in other places. So that has some of the same characteristics as nitrate in terms of its spatial variability. We felt like we wanted to call out naturally occurring in parentheses. Road salt is present in some cases, particularly chloride is present in some cases with increasing trends that have been attributed to road salt in some places and not in other places. So I sort of hear where Steve is coming from is we can maybe consider adding some modifiers to it like spatially variable or in parentheses, we were willing to do that with arsenic. Maybe it's a possibility that we could consider something like that for road salt, nitrate, to indicate that it's spatially variable. It depends on where you are. See X for more details. And that might sort of lessen the tendency that these things are all together.
Senator? I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. Charles, are you done? Go ahead. Yeah.
So I've been listening to this for a little while and just trying to figure out what is the role of this task force? Is it I mean, I guess what's the greater danger, right? To minimize something or to ring an alarm bell that maybe is inappropriate for the entire aquifer? And here's where I come down on it. I don't know if I think it's a good idea to put it in two different categories. I think that's inherently confusing. And if it belongs in two categories, I think it should be placed in the more severe category. Because if it's a threat, it's a threat. Now, the danger to that, and again, Steve, you can talk to this, if this sets up some kind of a, by being placed there, sets up some kind of protections, which, I'm not aware of, in which case we should consider. But if the only concern is, well, we don't want the legislature to overreact if it's not a problem for the whole aquifer, I would point out, there are 3 legislators that are in this room and have been coming to many of these meetings, and I think we could certainly hear the Farm Bureau out in terms of what the response is to that. But what I guess if I look back at this 10 years from now and said, what would I be more embarrassed about? It would not be we overemphasized the danger to nitrates for the eastern side, because the western side's already in danger, and frankly, it's a body of water. So I don't feel that much better being on the eastern side of it, because we're all drinking from the same larger body. But to me, the greater danger is that we, after all this work, minimize something that turns out to be a greater thing. So I would prefer, I guess my 2 cents is I'd prefer if it fits in 2 categories, and that goes with any of these, arsenic, you name it. If it goes in 2 categories, I think the proper place is in the most severe category, and then we can work in the legislative side to be appropriate as to how we deal with that from a legislative remedy. But I think if I like, the split the baby or try to keep both sides happy, that's a legislative instinct too, right? To try to make everybody happy. But I think to a lay person reading it, and frankly to a legislator reading it who's just as lay or just as non-scientific as anyone reading the report, I think it could be inherently confusing. That's just mine.
All right. So Diane Marlin, Mayor of Urbana. And if comparing nitrates to the people's gas situation is a problem, then maybe we should specifically call out people's gas as being a really, really serious problem. I mean, if your water's catching on fire, I would say that's an important issue to think about.
I'm sorry, go ahead. To talk about the people's gas issue, that was brought up, I think, in the March meeting when George had his rubric, and we were talking about threats. And I asked him, I said, the people's gas issue isn't a threat, it's a reality. And that should be looked at as a reality. It's such a reality, it's in litigation. And at that time, much of the people's gas issues that we would like to deal with have been somewhat muted because of the litigation process. But to get back to why we're calling it a threat, it's different than a guy with a glove on than a guy that hits you with it. Now it's a reality. And how you want to classify that, how you talk about minimizing something, to take a reality of what we have out there where people are drinking bottled water and have lit their water, that's minimizing that to the point of threat. It's not a reality. So how we would to deal with that as a task force, it's us to vote, decide, however.
Make reference to this. Yeah, you can. What I was going to say on that, and you and I've had some discussion here, I think, as we've had the dialogue back and forth here, I think as it started out, splitting them in 2, but I think as we've heard some concerns here, I think there's some, I don't know. I guess I'm falling on the category more if they're all in one category, and what you say the most severe is the threat. I think your comments, I understand very well on that. Because on the other side of it, I think from a lack of a better term, we still have the sidebars in here, especially in the, I call it the subcommittee part. I always printed out here about that part of it that goes into that detail, so it's still in there. So I'm trying to say is, I guess, I don't want to get dissecting too much here into two parts. I guess I'm concerned about the confusion it would cause, and I'm trying to get everybody to understand it. That's my feeling on it.
I would just ask too, and maybe it's not possible to do this, but I thought that Claudia's question that she raised was a good one about helping the rest of us understand the potential ramifications of one classification or another. So what are we afraid of? And if we have a better understanding of that, that would help.
Can I address
Yeah, sure,
Senator
George.
Bennett's point? It's George Rocap from the Water Survey. If you look at the maps of chloride and road salt or nitrate and arsenic, and some of the analysis, like the nitrate, include a lot of shallow wells. And so, yes, technically, maybe that's not the Mahomet Aquifer, maybe it is, but the people who live out here don't necessarily know that their well's in the Mahomet, or they might assume they're in the Mahomet, but actually they're a very shallow well. So they might be at risk for one of these other things without even knowing that they're at risk, because they look at a assessment of the Mahomet and think, oh, well, it's free of arsenic or free of nitrate or free of road salt. But in reality, they're on a shallow well, and people don't necessarily know what their well is completed in. And so, which I don't expect them to, but I don't necessarily want to give them a false sense that their well is safe when, unless we make sure that they know that their well is in the Mahomet Aquifer. But most people don't know that.
Senator.
Can I just ask a quick procedural question? I know I'm going to have to step out here in a moment. We're on page 7 of a longer report, and this is good, right? I don't want any skipping over these things, but I guess was curious, is the plan to get through all of this today for those of us in the room, or is there a subsequent meeting that we should?
I mean, our next scheduled meeting is December 19th, and our report is due at the end of the year. So, I mean, it seems to me we probably need to be talking about at least another few meetings. I think there's going to have to be redrafting, and I'm hoping that Rick is going to have the assistance of PRI to redraft. But we also have, I'm kind of keeping a list of what I think are outstanding issues that we're all going to have to vote on, whether it's in or out, or whether there's a minority report attached. And we've got, 40 days to do that.
Thank you. Thank you, Senator Bennett. It's difficult for us to schedule more than 2 hours, but I've submitted from our panel all of our comments to this report already, and I'm just interested in how we're going to either put them in or out. And I think in this case, getting through this document is going to be, in this form, will be a very, very long meeting.
Well, my concern is if we don't go through each of the comments and have the committee sort of response to that, or a vote up or down, who is determining whether those comments get in?
Right, so I think that the comments that, we've submitted ours in writing, and so procedurally, I would love for us to just go through the people's submissions of changes and say, okay, discuss those changes as because we don't disagree with the entire report, right? With the entire
I
draft.
think that's what we're doing. I think what Rick is doing, we got stopped at Senator Rose's comment. So, I mean, 2 hours in, we're at page 7
No,
or whatever.
that was Senator Rose's comparison to what you were talking about, because he asked those questions. So we went to those comments and had Todd here to address those.
Would it be feasible before we leave to go over the comments only?
Yeah, we can do that.
I'm going to say it one more time. That's what we're doing.
We got to those, and that's where we are.
I heard that part, but I'm still a little confused.
We're also commenting on a different version of the report, so it's hard to go through, I submitted line by line comments on the previous report, so we can't really we're looking at a new report at the same time that we're sort of going through comments on the report. So I have comments on this report because it's new.
Well, but it's
That are
new
new.
that I got it out to you about 2 weeks ago.
Did you want me to submit comments and then you put them in here? Was that the idea again? Okay.
Could do
Well, I
whatever
didn't-
you
I didn't have time.
want to do.
Which is what I think I'm saying that because I did submit
I'm going to
mine.
ask everybody to be quiet for a second so I can hear Representative Ammons. Thank you.
So when we got the initial draft, we went through that part in our panel. The panel then submitted, led by Chris Storr, submitted the recommendations that should, as we felt, be included in this report. And I'm just trying to understand where I haven't seen anybody else's submitted recommendations, and is this report reflecting people's submitted recommendations? I guess that's what I'm trying to make sure I understand.
We just haven't gotten there yet. They're here. You want me to go right down to yours?
No, I'm just trying to understand procedurally how we're going to get through all of this.
No, that is the next set of bubbles. They're right here. So your recommendation.
Okay, so these little drop downs is people's recommendations that's submitted.
So that's where we're at. These are the next set. If we are going by the comments, we go to the legacy landfill worksheet, and Claudia's recommendation is the same as Chris Storr's, is the same as Representative Ammons. So they're both
So,
right here.
Rick, can I ask you, to Andrew's point, did you take his comments that were related to the first draft and transfer them into the second draft?
I absolutely
his
did.
work-
Many of them
okay.
went away because of Andrew's comments, because of the reorganization recommended by the full task force that occurred. I can't remember if you were at the,
Right, but that's the point I'm making is that never mind, whatever.
So is there some place where we have his written comments that pertain to the items that are in the report are still preserved?
absolutely, we still have Andrew's stuff. For example, a lot of his comments were on the executive summary. Yet, Andrew, you look
I
frustrated.
guess my concern is that this document we're looking at, the way, I mean, it was rewritten, so a lot of this is different and presented in a different way. So we're discussing this, we're not discussing the last draft. And there wasn't a time frame given for comments on this draft. There was a time frame given for comments on last draft that we had due date, give them to you. We submitted those comments, you reviewed them, you put this together. So to say we can only talk about written comments that were previously submitted on this draft when it's a new draft that didn't have an agreed timeline on when we were supposed to submit comments on it seems a little, I mean, I feel like I've made the comments I want to, but they're not in the document. That's okay. Because
Well,
I had a chance to
I
look here,
redid
but-
the draft based on the comments received from the task force. So I reorganized it based on what you all told me to do. So it's reorganized based on what the task force told me to do.
I would also, and I know that this is more work, but the goal is not to prevent you from commenting. So this is not the last and final draft. We will have an opportunity to continue to make comments. I am assuming that we're going to get a third draft with the PRI help and hopefully the executive summary and more information that everybody is still going to want to make comments on.
Yeah, if I get it in a timely fashion, I mean, I'll do my best.
So Rick, what is the plan with respect to the comments that you have bubbled? Are you looking for direction from us today as to incorporate or don't incorporate?
Yes.
So you can take that to your
Yes,
next draft?
those have not been vetted by the full task force.
Okay. So can you tell us, because do you know how many there are total?
I couldn't tell you how many there are, but we can walk through them.
Okay. Some of them have several parts. Right. So we are on the first one so far, right?
Well,
Is
we're
there a
now to
second?
the next page.
Okay.
But we didn't make a decision on the previous ones, whether they're in or out. That's what I'm trying to get to.
That was a response to the senator's questions regarding the landfills. So there wasn't really a decision made. I mean, I think it was informative. There wasn't like a recommendation to put in or out, right, Chapin?
Yeah, I mean, well, I didn't know where the right time to say it was, but, you know, I don't, there's been the suggestion somehow we're precluded from our legislative meeting by discussing this topic. I don't think that is the case at all, because it's anything that could potentially affect the aquifer in the future is both and for. I'm always for more input and less input as well. And you now have a court case, you now have two appellate decisions that are in competition, which means that potentially this will go to state Supreme Court. And I have thought for some time, and unlike other things that have come up at the last minute, I go back to the first meeting we had, I sincerely brought this issue up, as one of the things I wanted to talk about. But, you know, I think it makes sense that local, you know, when you have at least a change of classification from household waste to some other waste, then there needs to be some additional local input to that. Now, if people don't want to deal with that now because it's the last, you know, because the intervening committee didn't get to it, I would put it in a concurring, you know, separately concurring during the report. If people want to deal with it now, I'm fine with that too. But I think that if there's an open question out there that ultimately the legislature is going to have to answer anyway. And, you know, if you guys want to make a recommendation that says that further study needs to be made of how we can strengthen local impact and, you know, local input, I'm fine with that too.
So-
I just don't think we can walk away not having at least addressed a problem out there.
So in order for Rick to have direction in drafting, do you want to make a motion that incorporates whatever that you want, you know, citing, you want it to go back through local citing if there is a change or whatever your specific language is? If we get a second, then we can vote on that.
Very real problem, okay? Every permit modification does not need to go back to the site. I mean, that's just a fact. When you result in changing the form and substance of what was approved locally to something, you know, from X to Y, then yeah, you know, you should go back. And you know, I'm not sure how I state that in form of a motion, but that's really, I think we need to have more input in this over the long haul on this city question. I'll tell you what, here's another thing that I've been recommending that I think we have not this group, but there ought to be a regional group that is a panel out of this going forward to go answer some of these questions. Because we simply don't have all the time necessary to go into a lot of these things. And, you know, the truth of the matter is, this would be the perfect thing for a further study, you know, by you know, a permanent or semi-permanent body. And if I was going to make any recommendation at all to add to this, it would be that this not conclude on December 31st, but that we have an ongoing aquifer protection regional group that can assess and address these types of concerns. So, you know, I don't care what, I'm easy, I'm going to go with the group. But,
And I appreciate that. I am trying to, though, I think Rick can't include things in the report that we don't have at least a majority of the committee members supporting. And we've had a lot of general discussion. So if there's something specific that you want incorporated, yeah, I think there has to be a motion to incorporate.
So I'm going to make this motion in this order. I think that we ought to add a permanent, semi-public, private, quasi-body to a recommendation to answer additional questions going forward.
Donovan, before you ask a question, do we have a second? A second by Representative Ammons.
Purely just a question. Doesn't, and I don't know, so, but George, correct me wrong, isn't there already an existing body? Isn't there already a Mahomet Aquifer Consortium or some type of body that has a role in this outside of this task force, and I don't know, maybe that role isn't what the senator's recommending, I just.
There is. It is a loosely configured group of counties and municipalities. What I'm suggesting is that we would have part of our recommendation legislature to sort of make that official.
One thing about that loosely affiliated group as well is that there aren't really resources directed to it. So I know like City of Champaign has paid for things, and so have some of the other consortium members. But to the extent they need technical expertise or lawyers, there's no process for that. And so I would suggest, Chapin, if you're constituting a group, that you also be thinking about having some funds available, not necessarily for the members, but for if the members need the expertise.
Yeah, I mean, my only thought is that questions like the first one I raised in the bulletin, where we had this little colloquy here for 5 minutes, really would be far better put to a Mahomet Aquifer consortium that has some finality to it over time, rather than trying to shotgun something here. And I understand that, but I also have constituents I represent that there's a
The consortium, too, is primarily focused on water quantity, not quality, just FYI.
rather than sort of an informal consortium. But
Charles.
Charles Hostetler with PDC. I'd like to, we've had a motion and a second now, is that correct? I'd like to ask the indulgence of the task force that we open up a blank workspace and put down exactly what it is we're going to be voting on.
that's a good point.
Because I would like to know before I cast my vote exactly what the wording of this is and how it looks. Thank you.
Teresa Barnett, Dewitt County. Senator Rose, I have a question, a clarification. So when you're talking about putting in place some type of permanent group, you're talking about representatives from outside of the task force, correct?
I'm not talking about us. I'm talking about units of local, like, I'm talking about the Mahomet, like giving formality to Mahomet for the consortium to some extent.
Those groups that are already in existence, that are already dealing with some aspect of the aquifer. Thank you.
Can I ask a question?
The Mahomet Aquifer, this is George, the Mahomet Aquifer Consortium has received funding from the state before, but it's largely exists on donations from many of the people in this room, so. But it is, as Rick said, largely focused on water quantity issues, and we do have a recommendation on page 24, number 4, to establish a group, and that's one of the recommendations, if you look on page 24, recommendation number 4. So perhaps that's a place to build on, or if you want to change that language to include some of the things you wanted to talk about.
I'm fine with that. And all I'm, let me just put this on the record, since all I'm suggesting is there's going to be a lot of little things that didn't get considered that are going to show up in these notes that would be far better put to that body going forward than leaving them untouched.
Well, I think it's worthwhile to have discussion at some point about what that committee should look like and who it should include, but there is something in there.
Alec Davis, Illinois Environmental Regulatory Group. I just wanted to, I guess, agree with George. From our list of recommendations that we all voted on, number 7, that's basically what I thought that was doing. And then to see it reflected on page 24, I think basically accomplishes what we're talking about.
I'd like to make a comment on what you just said, Alex. At the time that the number 7 was voted on, the word empower and management was a roadblock to a lot of people about how they were going to vote on that particular item. And what he is drafting now was a revision of that to regulate it in a task force type of scenario, not to manage, but to give advice. This is a unique group of people from 25 different reasons, which gives it strength. And it's also why it's got its problem. But to keep it and then bring in outside agencies like people that we have commenting, that's what I think the future should look like for our task force if it moves forward and stays together. Call them together, the people that are involved in the agency thing can come, and then we can have other people involved to make the decisions as they come up, or the ones that we can't finish off today. And I think that's what that statement that Rick's now drafting up might say.
Representative Ammons.
I think that I think the feeling is that we're in agreement with the motion that's been made by Senator Rose. I'd like to call the question, and the additional comments that we've already submitted, Dr. Story is here, who is the lead on our panel for that. I didn't plan 3 hours for this, so I have to run. But any technical questions could go to Dr. Story on our recommendations that we submitted. And I'd like to call the question.
Okay, well, a couple things, and I want to be respectful of everybody's time. We talked at our last meeting. I mean, I have the whole day blocked out for this. We have 40 days. I mean, so before Representative Ammons leaves, I think we need a consensus about how we're going to move forward to do this, because this is big work and we're a large group. Wordsmithing with 20 people is never easy. But if we have to have a way to absorb each of the comments and vote on them, because they are changes to what the task force agreed to. I mean, the initial report was what the 2 subcommittees agreed to, and everything else that's come has been fine. It's been good information, but it has not been vetted by the task force as a whole. So if someone has a suggestion about how we can trim down that time and actually, we don't have time to go back to subcommittees with each of those comments. We absolutely have to talk about them. Representative Rose.
So that's my thought, Mayor. I mean, if you get this other entity going past December 31, then that's where those other issues can, largely land. I'm not going to speak for anyone who's made suggestions, because I'm sure they've all got things they want to talk about today, but that is a more than appropriate place to continue looking at things over the long haul and on a regular basis after December 31. It's just my thought.
And if I can just clarify my
Sure.
point, the draft report that we received, we responded to that draft report, and then this came as a result of that draft report to incorporate those ideas. I think as we read through these ideas, if we, in between these meetings, could simply send either you support or don't support that idea to the task force ahead of this meeting, then we don't have to do this.
It's right here, Representative. It was sent to everyone.
No.
Here.
I got that part,
Oh.
right? I got that part, that we received those, but we didn't receive either objections or support
yeah.
for the ideas.
Well,
before
so
we
here's my concern. I think it violates the Open Meetings Act to do it that way. We are a public body, and unlike the legislature, we have Open Meetings Act issues. I don't think we can be voting via email about what we want in and
No,
what
I didn't
we
say
wa-
vote. I didn't say
Well,
vote. I said respond.
But so
comment.
we cannot respond to all committee members. or we violate the Open Meetings Act. We can't have communication.
But we can respond back to the person writing the draft.
What if
Andrew.
we get a summary list of substantial changes based on, the major discussions that we've had today? We have a week for Illinois EPA or whoever to compile those into a list of, 60 bullet points or whatever it ends up being. And that list goes out to the group and we all prepare our up-down votes on each one of those issues. And we come back to the next meeting with a tallied up, I guess that's voting off, but
I
we'll bring
think
it public. It'll be.
that would be fine. And are we saying we want no discussion? We're just voting up or down? We're just going to go through the list and vote up or down on the items?
I think the discussion can be limited to some degree because we've gone through some of these things prior already. And if there's like Senator Rose's suggestion to create a continued or officially put the consortium into as a quasi-government body to follow the the rest of the recommendations that will not be touched here through the end of December. It can be continued work, meaning the recommendations or the summary of this project will simply say that the task force was not able to address every single issue that may be a threat to the aquifer, but this continued group will do that and follow up annually on that and submit to the General Assembly. For us, it's obviously very difficult for us to answer every single one of these threats and everything in this format. It just doesn't produce the results we want.
I totally agree. I totally agree. So go ahead, Donovan.
So one thing I've noticed in the last couple of meetings we've had, we do these drafts and we ask for comments and changes to the drafts. And then when we come together, there are a lot of good comments, a lot of recommended changes in here, but then there are brand new ideas. And we've spent, 10 months now going through to making what's in this draft agreed upon. And I don't think that someone can come through with a brand new idea that hasn't been vetted or discussed in the last 10 months and suggest that as a recommendation that gets the same type of vote as other material that's in here. So if there is a recommendation that someone has in the next week, I guess if we're doing this, that, well, I think this should be listed as a threat, when that hasn't been discussed over the last 10 months, when it hasn't gone through both subcommittees, but then we're going to be able to vote on it just the same as we'd be able to vote on everything else, I don't think that's fair. I think that what we're voting on needs to be what we've made over the last year. And I'm not talking, and the senator's thing is in here. That's been discussed. That's an example of what we should be doing. But if we're all going to go back and make changes and suggestions, I don't think that someone can come in with a new concept and have it be voted on at the next meeting, having not gone through the process of everything else.
Charles.
For clarification, what I thought I heard the mayor suggest was that we go through the ones that exist now and just compile them into a list. Or maybe it was Claude.
I actually think Andrew had that great idea.
And it was somewhat placed off to my left. Okay, somebody had the idea of compiling them into a list, right? What exists. That's different than saying you now have 5 working days to send in anything you can think of. And I would be in favor of compiling what we have existing here into a written, is this a form in which it's firm and concrete and I can ask my management about, and my peers and my colleagues, and say, I can support this, or not.
So basically printing a comments page, which I think Word would do for us.
In that format, yes. And that's different than bringing new stuff to the discussion, and I would
Okay.
strongly support that.
Okay, so we're a bit far afield. The representative has called the question. So are we prepared to vote on, and we can figure out where it gets incorporated or if it gets added to the section that's already talks about it? Senator Rose, you want to speak to that?
Yeah, so just to be, in my mind, if we kind of clean up the section where it discussed this already with sort of what we've got, there was a comment bubble up there at one point, Rick. Is that? No, so the comment bubble where everybody could see what the motion was. And I think what I'm suggesting to resolve all these other issues is that we compile those and say that the new group, these are things the new group should discuss. Is that kind of where you're going? Yeah. Serve should be as a quasi-government or governmental capacity. As a quasi-governmental. Well, I think what that becomes as you go through your list of things, those are comments that you would then have the option of recommending be considered later.
Defer it, right.
Yeah.
You could either settle it now, or you could defer it to this.
Yeah, you could vote it down now, or you could defer it later.
Okay, I just had a little sidebar with Chapin, but I still need some clarification. So are we talking about development of a totally different group of representatives from wherever?
Yes.
Not anybody from this task force to move forward with?
I don't think, it wouldn't preclude anyone from the task force becoming part of that, but it would just be a totally different body. So Teresa, let's just boil this down. The thought process is the legislature would somehow turn the Mahomet Aquifer Consortium into a actual arm of the state of Illinois, or some sort of, like I said, quasi-governmental or governmental, Rick, it should say or governmental.
The existing consortium?
Or no, but something like that.
Okay.
Quasi-governmental or governmental capacity.
And that's what I'm trying to get at. Is it a brand-new group, or is it giving more credence to an existing group that already deals with it?
I mean, we could decide that now, or the legislature could make the decision.
Well, because I think that's important for today's vote.
I do too. Teresa, when this was drafted, it was drafted. Necessary outside influences. You could call a certain issue that, let's say it's the man love issue. And Steve Turner, who's going to be, let's say, on this body that we're going to vote on, says, that's not something I need to be involved in, or I would like to be involved in. They show up. But not everybody has to show up. You could keep the whole task force together, or not. That's kind of what this was about, and trying to create that, because I don't think everybody wants to meet every month from 25 different places all over the place. But if the issue pertains to them and they feel it's necessary, everybody could, just like with the subcommittees we have. I think that's kind of how I envisioned that being done.
Representative.
You guys look at it or not?
I think in this sense, if we create it as a quasi-government, similar to any other board and commission that is authorized by the state of Illinois, which is what Senator Rose's motion is, it would have to follow the appointment process that we do for other boards and commissions for the state of Illinois. And so anybody could be on it if they wanted to be a part of that, but it would have to follow, of course, the General Assembly may appoint a couple people, the same process by which we do all other bodies in the state of Illinois. This would have to follow that same process. And I believe that that's why it's considered quasi-government, right?
Yeah, so, and just to kind of blend all these conversations, you got the consortium, which is already there. That would be an easy starting place. However, we've got some other good expertise in this group that isn't the consortium. So that quasi-governmental body could end up becoming larger than the consortium, or it couldn't. You could also do it on a case-by-case basis, depending on what exactly it is you're looking at, is my thought. But, Rick, it probably needs to be either serve in a quasi-capacity or serve in a quasi-governmental or governmental body. But I think in as opposed to as.
So I think everybody knows what we're voting on. Do we want to do it by roll call, or we do? Okay, so Barb, can you do a roll call? Bless you.
Thank you.
We're roll calling Chapin's motion.
I have a question before we do that, Madam Chairman. The governor set this committee up. Do we have the authority to act in this capacity?
We're just asking the
The General Assembly
legislature.
set this committee up.
Right.
And so what we're making is a recommendation to the General Assembly to pass a law to make this a permanent, not this particularly, but yeah.
And if I can,
A regional
then-
group.
Okay.
This is Donovan with the IMA. So the purpose of the task force would be purely advisory, and I believe that we brought up would just maybe on an annual basis or in a continuous basis provide reports to the General Assembly, but they would be completely advisory. They wouldn't have any authoritative role outside of that, correct?
I don't, my only hesitation in saying yes to that is that I would like it to be a vehicle for which grants could be received.
Okay.
That could write grants and have enough authority to write grants, receive grants, and hire people like PRI, for example, to do work.
That's a different meaning of the word authority.
But you're not creating another regulatory body. You're not creating IEPA or the Pollution Control Board. Okay, Barb, can you call the roll, please?
Barb, I'm sorry to be such a pain today, but before you call that roll, can somebody please read that motion as it is written, so we all understand exactly what we're voting on?
I move to develop a group with a mission similar to the Mahomet Aquifer Protection Task Force and a blend of other select individuals that serve in a quasi-government or governmental capacity to provide leadership, administrative structure, and processes for regional water supply.
Thank you.
Teresa, how do you vote?
Yes.
Yes.
There we go. Okay. Charles, how do you vote?
Aye.
Okay. Here we go. Okay. Jim, how do you vote? Where do we go down there? Donovan, how do you vote?
Pass.
Alec, how do you vote?
I'm going to vote no.
Andrew, how do you vote?
Aye.
Claudia, how do you vote?
Aye.
Deb, how do you vote?
Yes.
Representative Maymans, how do you vote?
Yes.
Diane, how do you vote?
Yes.
Mayor Smith, how do you vote?
Yes.
Keith, how do you have it? How do you vote? Steve, how do you vote?
No.
Eric, how do you vote?
Yes.
Mayor Wolf, how do you vote?
Yes.
Mayor Zaluka?
Yes.
The ayes have it. Piers? Donovan?
No.
Donovan votes no, changes his vote to no. Let me tally now.
Okay, so that is now included as a recommendation within our report and will appear. As I understand it, Representative, before you leave, do you want to, or maybe you can provide Barb some dates where you have a couple-hour blocks so that we're going to have some additional meeting?
I will send it back to her.
Okay, that'd be great. Thank you. So as I understand it, our next step is going to be that we're going to compile the comments list so that we can vote on that at another meeting, but that we are not adding additional new items. It's just the comments list as it exists. Andrew?
So, I mean, I think it's worth like highlighting the discussions that we've had. For example, I don't think there's a comment up there that says nitrate should or should not be listed, and I think that's an issue that we need to vote on because we didn't come to resolution on it, or the definition question. So I
Right.
think there are issues that we've discussed quite a bit that aren't in text comments, and so I would hope that we could synthesize some of the discussion in these meetings into a list of questions with those comments, and then
So-
have something final that we can all look at.
So I was trying to take notes as we went. So in addition to the comments, I have that whether or not in Appendix H, we need more detailed costs. The nitrates issue as whether it's a potential threat or a threat. The same with road salt. Definition for route, threat, and potential route. I can give this to
Somebody
you.
going to provide those definitions?
Right, but I want to read them, make sure the task force agrees that these are the issues. Whether or not we've identified sufficient resources for things like abandoned wells and or identified what the potential costs for that would be. The possibility of HTEM application for specific permit applications relating to hazardous activities was the language that was used. Should we add items to,
Let's make a suggestion here, why don't, and I don't want to cut you off there, but why don't we go look at all these comments, figure out if there's any of them that need to be discussed today that can't go into the vote on recommending to the future group list, right? Because I'm guessing most of these are going to be recommended to go to the future group list. Then we've got a couple things like Andrew and Steve have got an open dialogue going about the nitrate issue, and I'm with Zaluka. So, but we should go through, see if there's anything that people are absolutely, like my comment about permitting, I withdraw that comment because and it would put it on my list for the future group to look at. Does that make sense?
and here's my struggle. I feel like these comments were made with incorporate or don't incorporate in the report, not necessarily with an eye toward defer it to a group that we don't even know if it will exist.
And what I'm saying is now that we've got this third option, maybe people aren't interested in voting on their full comment today.
I don't know.
Some of them will be. Some of them will be.
George, did you have a comment?
Yeah, I would also, some of the ones you read off were from the public comment, so I don't know how those can fall in unless one of the committee members adopts them. So I think that needs to be separated.
I don't want to shift all this to some future group. We want to establish a future group to consider things that come up. That's fine, and that's how I vote. But to sit here and say things that we should be making a decision on here because we can't come to an agreement, or maybe because we don't get our particular way on, well, shit, I'm gonna throw it to a future group so I get a second bite of the apple. I think that's improper. That's what we should do, is come up with a list. And if you got, and this might have something to do with the Open Meetings Act, I'm not familiar with it. But certainly, you could have an advisory committee from a person from your A committee, a person from your B committee, you work together on this and go through all the comments. And I'm talking about comments we have to date, not comments that are gonna come in after the date. But what we've got, and come back with a full recommendation that we can vote on at our next meeting. You're just kicking the can down the road.
Well, I mean, I think From my perspective, the report reflects subcommittee A and B. There may be things that are missing because not everything got included with subcommittee A and B, but the items within the report at least went through A and B and then were approved by the task force. So the issue becomes with the additional items, do they become incorporated in? Do they become sort of concurring opinions or even dissenting opinions? And I don't have strong feelings about how we do that, but I think it is only fair to at least give task force members the opportunity if you know, I'll use Steve an example. If Farm Bureau doesn't want nitrates to be a threat and he wants to write a page or a paragraph about why he believes that that is not the case, then that gets included as a page of the report. He may not get any other support for it, but he needs to be able to do that for himself. Donovan.
And I think in similar fashion too, such as what we just voted on this empowering group, with, I think, 17-3, if none of the three write a dissenting opinion, the report won't reflect any dissension into that recommendation. Correct. So.
Teresa.
I'm sorry. Teresa Barnett, DeWitt County. I agree with what George said as far as some of the comments you were listing, Mayor, did come from the public comments, which I'm not saying that we shouldn't consider them, but I do think it has a bearing on how we vote upon them. You know, they can't just automatically be put in there because we as a task force have not discussed them. And I agree 100% with Keith in that we were established as a group to finish the objectives that were given to us. And if we need more meetings, because we are down to the wire, but we cannot let our year's work go unfinished. And if that means we have to schedule more meetings, I know it's seasons, it's holidays, but what we're doing is very important. And I'm willing, I don't think we can get this done in one more meeting. So, thank you.
And I would just, one of the reasons I incorporated the public comments is that prior to the meeting, I heard from Chris Storr that the most recent drafts and information were hard for him to access. And so I think we have a duty to hear the public's comments on our work. And if we're getting it emailed to us and we have a timeline we know about and we comment, but we don't give the public an opportunity to do so, I have some concerns about that. Mayor Marlin? I think it's include it, don't include it, or kick it to Chapin's committee are going to be our choice. Right. Well, right. I mean, to the extent it's replacing, yes. And if it, for example, if it does not get replaced, but Representative Ammons wants that alternative language as a concurring, this is what I would have said, then she can add it to the back as a concurring page, and whoever wants to sign on with her on that can do that. Donovan?
Well, in previous versions, when people have submitted comments and changes, they were incorporated by the agency, and we kind of, however best they could, and then we were presented with them to look at now. But now we're just voting specifically, each person can make a recommendation and get a vote whether that becomes what the report is.
Well, do we want the agency to just incorporate all these comments? I mean, that'd be
Well,
fine too, if that's
Well,
our
that's not what I'm saying, but
wish.
what if there are competing? And so I might agree with some that's in Representative Ammons, I might agree with some of what's in another person's, but if I vote for both of them, then they don't work.
Well, and Alex not here today, but I did bring Todd Ruddick, the bureau chief, there are some potential resource implications with the alternative proposal, because that's why I was trying to figure out, are these 807 landfills, or are these landfills that aren't under any regulatory program? And Todd could speak to that better than me, but that's a brand-new program.
Well, and I mean, we have him here, so it'd be nice to take it, I mean, I know everybody's tired and wants to go, but he's here, so do we want to give him the opportunity to at least comment on this, even if we're not voting on it today?
I don't want to comment necessarily for or against, and please don't take them that way, because I don't think that's my role. That's more maybe Alex's role. But it is fair to say that, if we're talking about a fairly detailed evaluation of 200 plus sites or 150 plus sites, really would be a significant resource issue for us. Right now, the Bureau of Land last year did about 2,500 inspections. So not above these, I'm just meant statewide. And so just from the context of that, this work would have to displace, given the current resources that we have, it would have to displace some of that. And typically what we try to focus as much as possible on are existing threats, meaning situations where we know there are contaminants in the environment that should be addressed. And so I think that's just worthwhile to consider as the group is figuring out what it wants to do or not do. Given current resources, there are limits to what we could do and still maintain the other workloads that we have. And a lot of our workloads right now are tied to the IEPA doesn't receive general revenue funds as a general matter from the legislature. We exist almost entirely on grants from US EPA or other federal agencies. I assume it's mostly US EPA, but and those grants always come with requirements. We need to do so much work, so many inspections, so many reviews of files, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, in order for us to continue to receive those funds and to be able to pay our people and to do that kind of work. So again, I'm not suggesting this is the right course or the wrong course. It's just that's a factor that I'd ask that you consider.
Representative or Senator Rose.
So one of the issues here, and Rick, I appreciate your attempt to throw these little comment buttons inside the document in the appropriate place, but it's almost made it harder for a lot of people didn't know they were there. So people are getting caught with it. I'd almost rather have it like, here are the 12 things that were being asked, and have some time to digest that. So where are we going? Yeah.
Well, I think the sense I'm getting is everybody's exhausted, and we're not going to do very much good work if we're all kind of tired and our brain hurts. So I think having a list of the comments that we have for our next meeting so that we can quickly talk through them and vote on them or discuss where they ought to be placed within the document, I think is a good next step. Then I think we can also at that meeting talk about any concurring opinions or dissenting opinions that, and kind of how we want to incorporate that in there. What I am concerned about, though, is not having PRI and IEPA still working toward this final document in the interim time between our next meeting. I know they can't incorporate comments we haven't approved yet, but I'm wondering if we can still be sort of tightening things up and putting in the maps and doing some of that work. Senator Rose?
So would it make sense to have the comments, I like Keith's point about having two people get together and sort them, but then have them submitted to everybody. We have a phone conference call where we could go one by one.
We're not allowed to.
We're not, I thought we approved that rule.
We allowed people to join our meeting, but we have to have an open meeting.
All right, well then, at the next meeting, we should have a meeting before the 19th, just to vote.
Right, and then I think we're gonna need a final document that everybody's gonna review as well prior to voting. So what is everybody's schedule like that first week in December? Or the last week in November, or maybe that's the same week?
Can we agree to expedite it? Can we agree on 2 people, though, that can work on this and come back? I know we can't do it.
What are they working on, though? I mean, I think we're going to take all the comments and print them as a list, right? I mean, I don't know what work goes with that.
All I'm talking about is making a record.
I think staff can just put it together. Yeah, this is Claudia Lunhoff with Champaign County Healthcare Consumers. I think it would be, helpful to have to somehow have a document that has all the different comments. And I don't know if people from the committees need to do it, or if this is something that's simple enough for staff to sort of pull together into a big Word document, or.
I've got this in a Word document and in a PDF, and I can just copy and paste the stuff that I wrote into the comments that you can open up and put it in a nice, plain vanilla Word document.
I actually think that Word will print you comment pages. I mean, I think you can tell it to print everything you have in those little bubbles as a separate.
Could be.
Oh, okay.
It's a PDF, but I also have this in Word. Because I put it in a PDF because do you want it to be editable? I wanted to make sure that no one was changing the task force
Right.
language.
Right.
So that's why I sent it as a PDF.
Yeah. That makes sense. Can you use Word to get the comments printed out and then save that as a PDF?
I
and
have
then
a
send
separate
that?
one in Word because some people couldn't open the comments in a PDF because they have
Yeah.
Apple. But yeah, I can do that. That
Okay.
shouldn't take long.
Okay.
Charles?
I so move we adopt the procedure you suggested with the modification you guys just made. As long as, my concern is each item needs to be specific so that we can take action on it.
So it's, this comment goes to page whatever, paragraph whatever.
And it's going to say this, or replace this with that, or kick this one down the road. Whatever it says, it's specific.
Who's,
It doesn't,
Some of them are and some of them aren't.
I mean, I took a guess as to where it goes, so
Teresa?
I don't have the task force's blessing on where it goes.
As far as the comments go, and I think everyone's comments are important, and I respect everyone's opinion, in this task force, and, we've worked hard on this for all year. But I would go back to something that Donovan said early on, is that this is our work. And that I think that we get in trouble if we start trying to add major things to this document. If discussing each other's comments, and I think that's important that we do that. If it helps us to tweak this in some way, which we've already been kind of tweaking things today, I think that's important, but I do not agree on this. We add this, we don't add this, we take this out, because we've worked on this all year. I mean, this is already a second draft. So I don't know, and if we're given this, we're stuck with our time limit, which is December 31st, I think we can only operate on what we've done, but yet I think it's important to discuss what everybody's comments are. So I don't know if that makes sense or not, but I just think we can't rewrite this document in November, December. Thank you.
Claudia Lenhoff. I just wanted to say, with regard to this document and the comments that are in place, I'm assuming that all of those comments that are in there, where Rick put a little, an icon for it where you could click on it, that all of those were submitted in the time frame that we discussed at our last meeting.
October the 9th.
Okay, so I know I submitted some and other people submitted some, and I saw them incorporated in there as far as so I think all of those were properly submitted. And I know people don't want to see a bunch of new stuff. I'm not really sure what the new stuff is, because I feel like most of what we've been talking about is pulling from the document. The public comments that were made are actually versions of comments that have already been circulating, and that I know Representative Ammons spoke to a while back. I don't really have a problem having a set of those as well to look at. But everything that's in the document right now, those comments, those were submitted in the time frame and in the process that we laid out at our last meeting.
Donovan.
I guess I should point out, and she probably more eloquently said what I was trying to say earlier, is previously, on previous drafts, we've submitted comments, and those comments were kind of taking as much as possible and made into this document. And now we're just voting on complete gut and replaces. And there is new information in some of these things. So Representative Ammon's comments, yes, we've talked about legacy landfills, but we've not talked about the type of programs that she's proposing in there. That's completely new, and that's the type of thing at this hour shouldn't be even something we're voting on. And I should also point out, just because you're submitting a comment doesn't mean it becomes part of this report. I think a lot of you in here would not want me submitting all my comments to become part of this report. Likewise, mine with yours. So while I respect the comments everyone has done, I think that voting to say, yes, we're going to go with Representative Ammons over what we've all worked on for 10 months is not appropriate. I would be a no on this regardless of how it comes, just because it's a new program. But I think we should just note that the agency did very well with previous comments and kind of blending them in. And this gut and replace thing is not the process we should be using.
I just wanted to say, with regard to the legacy landfills worksheet, at our last meeting, we talked about the fact that a draft worksheet had been submitted. It hadn't been incorporated fully into the report, and there was some discussion about that. But that didn't just appear out of, thin air. I mean, that was something that had been circulating, including within the work group. And then the other thing I wanted to say, well, two things. One, I very much appreciate the work that has gone into this. I have no idea how you did this out of all of our process. I think it's an amazing document. But this document has not been around for 10 months. We worked through a process very quickly. Some of the stuff has been around for 10 months, but we were working up until the last minute in our committees to bring stuff forward. And I think that having a list of or having somehow the comments incorporated and giving people can vote no on them. they can vote no, but they're already in the document right now, just not in a way where we can easily see them. And I think that's what we're talking about, is making them more easily visible so that you can make a decision about them, whichever way you want to go.
Okay, given our time frame, are we in agreement that this is it with comments other than maybe sort of reorganization or style or, you missed a typo kind of thing, right? This is going to be kind of our final vote at our next meeting. And hopefully we'll have a little bit more of an updated draft. They'll incorporate whatever these additional votes are, and we will have something complete then by that December 19th meeting that we vote up or down. And again, if people want to include a concurrence or a dissent or whatever it may be on separate pages, I'm fine with that. But we're done with additional comments. Is that where we're at? Is that consensus?
So where would discussion around nitrates or discussion around if we need to include a definition of threat?
I think the stuff that has been talked about today, in my head, I'm including as comments, right? So I'm going to submit my list to go with Rick's list of the little bullety point things. So the things the public has brought today, the things that we've discussed today.
So given that some of those are, the nitrate one's easy, but having a definition is more challenging and we don't have a proposal out, how do we move forward? We can't comment, we can't make an up or down vote on a not proposal, we just have disagreement.
Well, I think you're either going to want a definition or not want a definition. If the committee votes to have a definition, we're going to have to hopefully trust that PRI and IEPA can provide one within the
I'm not
document.
developing your definition for you guys. You're going to have to come up with that yourself. I'm not
Okay,
even
well,
on
we
the
can do
committee.
that at that meeting if it passes.
I'd happily work with somebody who wants to develop a definition we can agree on and propose.
Okay. Well, if the need for definition passes, we can then talk about what the definition will be. Donovan?
That's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
I'd happily work with somebody before, within a week I can even propose something on my own. I figure we'd do better having multiple voices, but.
And then if there are multiple proposed definitions, how do we handle that?
We vote on them, up or down.
And if both pass?
I mean, how would two definitions of the same thing
Well, like I
pass?
said, I don't know what definition, he's going to create. I might agree with a lot of it, and I don't know what definition someone else might agree. I might agree with what's in that too. Then I just have to choose which one I like better, even though I agree with some of the information there.
Or you can move to amend and combine them into one.
Can we work on it before? I mean, we can shoot some emails and have a couple of texts and. Well, but three of us can be in an email.
Yeah, you can have a few people. You can't have a majority of a quorum. So if the two of you want to talk, that would be great.
I'm open to it.
I know everybody's ready to bolt, but
Yeah, those are in here. Yeah, I mean, I can break them out as soon as I. Yeah, me too.
Okay, so with respect to the next meeting, do we want Barb to do like a survey monkey of when everybody is available? And we'll take whatever is the most number of people that are available? Do we think that she should do 2 dates? I mean, I don't mean survey 2 dates, but should we have meeting end of November and something else in between before that December 19th? And if we need to cancel it, we can, but that way we've got another one on. So we're looking for 2 more meeting dates before December 19th. Mm-hmm. Yep. I mean, I think you're probably looking at, yeah, I mean, we have 3 weeks in there, so we're going to have to meet quickly. December 19th is the, I'm sorry, 17th. I keep saying 19th. I apologize. My mistake. The 17th is our next scheduled Aquifer meeting. And I think we had actually agreed to have that 17th one in Springfield. Maybe I'm misremembering that. I have it on my calendar that way, but I don't know. So the, that'd be okay if everybody, I mean, that, I know, let's do SurveyMonkey because Representative Ammons needs an opportunity to let us know, and Senator Bennett when they're available as well. 17th? So PRI is, PRI had offered to work with IEPA. Is committee consensus yes, please do that? Everybody nodding their head yes? Okay. We have public comment again. Anybody from the public wish to address? Not seeing anybody. Any other committee comments? We are adjourned.